Good afternoon or morning, wherever you are joining us from for today's session, References, Do's and Do Nots, a complete guide for identifying and sharing professional reference information. My name is John Link. I am your host today for today's session and will provide a comprehensive overview of everything that you want to know about references, including what they are and why they're important, considerations for selecting a reference, strategies for preparing your reference list, common reference sources or those who you want to target to potentially serve as references for any hiring or any other type of process where you would need a reference, how to submit those references, information that you want to include, and I'll even throw in some reference examples. I am including the web link to today's presentation in the chat box. So if you're following along and can go into the chat box, you'll see that there is a web link for the Spark presentation. And I am also including information about resume writing and LinkedIn profile optimization services that I provide and some information there. And I'll also reference that again at the end of today's broadcast. Doing a deep dive and figuring out a little bit more about reference information and why it is so important to have a good understanding of what references can and cannot do is an important part of preparing for a hiring process. During the job, internship, or graduate application school process, you're likely going to be asked to submit a list of references, and these potential employers or graduate admissions professionals are going to rely on what your references are going to say about you or reinforce key information that is included in your application materials. They're important because it's another perspective that will reinforce that information and attest to your strongest areas of skills and qualifications related to the type of opportunity that you are being considered for. So they're extremely important. When selecting references, you need to begin thinking about some of these questions. One, how well does this person know who I am and how well can they speak to my strengths? Have your experiences with this individual been generally positive? So thinking about the interactions that you have had with this potential reference, are they going to speak positively about the information that you've referenced in your application materials? What was the nature of the past interactions that you've had with this potential reference? Meaning, are you a former supervisor of this potential reference? Was this person a former supervisor of yours? Were they just a colleague? Were they a collaborator or a colleague outside of your department or your office? Those are some important things that you need to think about when you're selecting who the references are going to be that you want to include as part of this application process. How much weight might this reference's opinion hold to a potential employer? It's important to think about what they're going to say, but also how that perspective is going to be furthering your candidacy for consideration and moving forward, hopefully to extend an offer of employment. And what kind of interactions have you had that can let the reference speak to your ability to perform the responsibilities of that position? And that's key here because you want to make sure that you've had enough experience with this potential reference that you're going to be able to give them plenty of examples to reinforce the information that you're referencing in your application materials so that they can speak in more depth about any questions that a hiring official is going to ask them when checking those different references. So lots of things to consider, especially when you're looking at who you would like to select and how you're going to approach this next step of preparing application materials. The best place to begin is just brainstorming a list of people who can potentially serve as references. You're likely going to have No more than 5 references included as part of any application that you're going to need references for. But it's okay to have more than 5, and you can select different references to be a part of different hiring processes. For instance, if you're looking at a potential position that's going to have a lot of supervision responsibility, you may have 1 or more references that you have previously supervised or you are currently supervising. This will give them an opportunity to speak more specifically about your leadership skills, your leadership styles, your ability to effectively lead them and supervise them and manage them. So that's a great way for you to identify some people who can really reinforce some of that key information. But if you're applying for other types of positions where you may need to emphasize a little bit more in another area, you may not need to have 2 references that speak to your ability to supervise, manage, or lead. Maybe it's another area that you're looking to emphasize. So think broadly about who you would like to identify, but also think strategically when you're preparing a reference list that will be tailored along with your resume and cover letter for any of those specific positions. Providing 3 to 5 quality references per application is the standard. Typically, employers are going to request no fewer than 3 and no greater than 5. So preparing what references you would like to be featured in a specific employment application is going to depend on what job you're applying for. Now remember, your job search plan should be targeted to a very specific goal that you have for employment. So when looking for different types of positions, you also want to consider how your references are going to be important as part of that story you will be sharing about yourself. Part of moving through this hiring process is requesting permission from those who can speak specifically about your skills, qualifications, and overall strengths. Requesting permission is a is very important because you never want to catch a potential colleague off guard if they have been contacted by a hiring manager for a position that you didn't share with them. You didn't share with them your goal, or you didn't share with them that you were interested in looking at opportunities for professional growth outside of your current company. And this may come as a surprise to them. So request permission, but also communicate your goal to current colleagues, especially if those current colleagues or a supervisor may serve as references when you're moving through that hiring process. It's also important that that goal is very specific. So if you're looking at opportunities for professional growth, you're having a candid conversation with your supervisors so that you can let them know that you're very much interested in opportunities and appreciate all of the development that they have given you over your time working with them, and that you're interested in using that as an opportunity to move forward, whether that's in your current company or outside of your current company. Thinking about what that goal is going to be key so that your references know exactly what your goal is for advancement and how they can help support you if they agree to serve as references through this hiring process. One thing that is extremely important when moving through a hiring process is to communicate the outcome of your search to those who have agreed to serve as references as part of this job search strategy that you've developed. When moving through any sort of hiring process, you're typically going to have references connected to toward the end of that process. And that's typically one of the last steps that will be checked off the hiring officials' to-do list before moving candidates further along or communicating the outcome to those who are being considered for the position. So it's also important for you to let somebody know that if you've accepted an offer and that person had served as a reference, that you're keeping them in the loop and thanking them for serving as a reference, because you can communicate effectively your skills and qualifications in an interview, but those who are going to be reinforcing that information as a reference will ultimately be golden in the eyes of the employer, because they're going to be giving that secondhand view, firsthand view of how effective you were in that role, and asking you some very specific questions that are going to help determine the overall fitness and readiness for that next position. So communicating that outcome and thanking them for their time and willingness to serve as a reference is going to be important, so that they're not questioning where you're at in that process. Common reference sources include anybody from your current manager or supervisor, if you've communicated effectively what your goal is for that next step of your career, previous managers or supervisors, if you have the ability to connect with your current colleagues or clients, if you're client facing, about your interest in moving into another kind of role or position. It's good to loop them in and ask if they'd be interested in serving as a reference. Prior colleagues or clients, and academic instructors, past or present, and thinking about that in combination with all of the other people who are going to reinforce information about who you are professionally will give you a good, well-rounded list of people. But I highly recommend beginning with, in this order, current managers or supervisors, and then moving down and kind of prioritizing where you want to spend time identifying those who are potentially good references for whatever process you'll be moving through. One thing that I get asked a lot, as this is typically a part of an actual online application, is should I indicate that if I am moving through this hiring process, that the employer can contact my current employer or my current supervisor, and whether to indicate that they are willing to release that information so that they can contact your current employer or manager. And sometimes people do not disclose to their supervisor or manager or any of their colleagues that they're interested in moving into another role. And that's just a judgment call in the actual application. You don't need to disclose that information to them, but there needs to be some professional courtesy. If you are moving to a stage where it's likely you will be accepting a role, you're going to have to communicate at some point that you will be either putting in a notice, your resignation, and transferring out of your current role. So just kind of knowing how you want to approach that conversation, whether it's beginning with asking them for permission to add their contact information on a reference list, or whether it's after you've been through the hiring process and you're now in the negotiation stage of accepting an offer of employment, and how you're going to communicate that information so that they are in the loop with what your goals are and where your next big career move is going to take you. I don't recommend including relatives as references unless you have directly worked with them, and that's through significant work experience, and this would be paid experience. There can be a lot of bias that somebody who is related to you would have as part of just how the potential hiring official may perceive that relationship. So I definitely don't recommend including them unless your work experience has completely been family run, and this is something that has been a part of your longstanding work history, and there's no other people that can potentially serve in that capacity. But that would be important for you to indicate, and I'll show you a strategy of how to do that in the coming sections. Keep in mind, again, that the primary reason that you are going to be connecting with these potential references to speak positively about yourself is that they're going to be the ones that are going to truly help the hiring official make a good determination about how you are going to be a good fit for that position. You can sing your own praises all day long in an interview and reinforce every piece of information that they're requesting that you have demonstrated proficiency in or experience with, or how you would handle something, but it's going to be those references who are going to ultimately be gelling that information for yourself, on behalf of yourself, in that last stage of the hiring process. So please kind of really consider who those people are going to be, because they're going to be singing your praises, they're going to be reinforcing that key information, and you are ultimately responsible of who gets to be in those roles serving as references on your behalf. There are some different ways people approach submitting references as part of a hiring process. One way I recommend to avoid is wasting any space on your resume to include reference information. I've seen a variety of templates that have used uh, sections of a 1 or 2 page document that would include reference information. However, I don't think that that's the best use of that space when you could be directly stating information that will further your candidacy. So I recommend not including reference information on a resume. It just seems like a valuable piece of real estate on your document that could be used to reinforce key skills and qualifications, not contact information for somebody to tell them that information about yourself. Also, I highly recommend not including that you're able to provide a list of references upon request on your resume. One, it screams template. It just isn't the most polished way to share that if you were asked to produce a list of references, you'd be able to. Because if you're able to submit a resume and a cover letter and complete an online application, the hiring official knows that you're able to submit a list of references. So avoid using any space on your resume for sharing that kind of information. And I've said this before to clients I've worked with and students that I work with, that you wouldn't want write, I'm also available for interviews upon request. Just because we don't say that. We know it's inferred that we would be able to connect with them and speak with them about our interest and related experience and skills in the position in an interview. We don't need to disclose that information and waste space in our application materials. So keep that in mind when you're submitting references. It's also really important that you're thinking about how you're going to format and share information about your professional references. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the information that you want to include in this document. You want to include the name and their current job or position and the company that they're working at. The phone number with area code and email address are the only pieces of contact information that you really need to include. No mailing address is necessary, as no hiring official is going to mail anything to those individuals. So you don't necessarily need to include any of that information as part of how you will format the contact information for each of your references in this standalone document. It's an optional piece of information, but you can write a 1-sentence statement explaining your relationship with that individual. For instance, if it is a current supervisor or a current colleague, you may indicate that in the line beneath each of the pieces of information that you're including. As I said, it's not necessary, but it does help the hiring official know a little bit of background about how you are connected to that person. There are some natural inferences that a hiring official is going to have when they are when they are looking at where the person works and where you have worked, they'll be able to connect some of the dots. However, it does help the hiring official know if that isn't exactly clear in any of your application materials. When looking at ways to be consistent as far as formatting, if you're using any sort of honorific like Dr., Mr., Mrs., Reverend, etc., you want to make sure that you're being consistent with all of your references. So I just always want to emphasize that consistency is very important throughout all of your application materials. So always do a thorough read through of information, not just on your reference sheet, but also looking at other components of your application materials so that there's consistency. While most hiring officials are going to request that you're importing this information directly into an online application, sometimes this information is requested as a standalone document. Sometimes it's both. They're asking for this information at the beginning of the hiring process, and you're including that in the actual application itself. Sometimes this information isn't requested until the very end of the process when they're ready to conduct reference checks for those who they have identified as finalists for a specific position. So know that it is possible that employers may have asked for you to include this information as fill-in information in an employment application. However, they may ask you to submit a list of references as part of an attachment when you're applying for a position as well. So here are some strategies on how that could be formatted and just being consistent with the overall look. So I think it's important that as part of, and this is an area of expertise of mine, when you're looking at branding yourself and standing out, you want to make sure that you are being consistent with how you are coming across to anybody who is going to be reviewing your resume, cover letter, and any other information about your professional selves. And a part of that is preparing a brand strategy for yourself. So here's an example of it's a fake profile of a candidate who is preparing a list of references for a specific employment opportunity. And as you can see, the reference document mirrors similar formatting to the actual resume itself in the header. That's important here as you're beginning to build some consistency across multiple areas of your professional brand. And sometimes, like I said, this reference sheet is not requested as a standalone document. It may be fill-in information as part of what you would include in the actual application for employment. However, it is pretty good to have ready to go when and if it is requested, and it shows that you put time into building consistency across multiple areas of your employment documents. Another area to really emphasize here is focusing on how many references you will want to include on the actual final document. As you can see here, there's only 3 in this example that's on your screen. There's only 3 examples of references that would be included in this hiring process. Maybe they are requesting no greater than 3, no fewer than 3, and this may be the standard. Whatever that is, follow the directions of the application, but always remember no fewer than 3, no greater than 5, and whatever that may be for you and how you are going to be putting those references together is going to be a decision that you need to make, and how you're going to keep in mind that the hiring official is only going to likely call or communicate via email no more than 3 likely. So thinking about who you want to serve and keeping that order as top reference at the very top, who's going to have the most exposure to having a firsthand view of your skills and qualifications, and then following with any other references that are going to be listed in that format will ultimately be the order that they go through. And last, here's another example of just a generic formatted example. This one does not include how a candidate may have known or does know a specific reference, and that's okay. It's not necessary, it's not required to include how you know that potential reference. However, it is very helpful to the hiring official if that's laid out very clear. But again, I just want to reinforce that it is not wrong if you do not include that information. And that, to be honest, was completely new to me when I was moving through hiring processes earlier in my career. I didn't know that that may be helpful to a potential hiring manager if I would include that information. I noticed that there are a few questions that have come into my inbox, but I'm also going to give you an opportunity to ask questions so that I can help facilitate a conversation about some best practices and advice for sharing contact information for professional references. So I noticed a few hands are up and that there's some questions now being poured into the box. So I want to make sure that I'm getting that. All right. So I just want to reinforce that there is a direct link to today's presentation in the box. So a couple questions came in to me about accessing some of these examples and that being shared after the presentation. It'll be shared, but you can also click directly in the chat box. There's a web link to the presentation. As long as you have an internet connection, you'll be able to access the slides for today's presentation. So thank you for that. If anybody is having an issue with sound and cannot hear me, can you please let me know? Is anybody else having an issue with sound? Okay. I noticed a couple people mentioned that there is some sound issues. Okay, so only a couple people had some sound issues. So I just tried fiddling with my own sound just to make sure, and I'll speak a little bit louder just in case some others may have difficulty with the sound. So another question that commonly comes up, and this just was asked in a direct question to me, is recommendations via LinkedIn. How valuable are recommendations with any information that you're including in your public LinkedIn profile? So my recommendation for how you would approach any solicitation of recommendations via LinkedIn is to, again, think strategically about this list right here on your screen. Any current managers or supervisors or prior managers or supervisors that you can request to serve or prepare a written no greater than probably 4, 5, 6 sentences that you can review before publishing to your LinkedIn profile. The more you build up to include in your public profile is going to reinforce some of the key information that you've included on that LinkedIn profile in the sections above those recommendations. It's also good because many hiring officials, if you have included on your resume, for instance, a web link to your LinkedIn profile, or some hiring official has contacted you or a recruiter has contacted you via LinkedIn, they're likely going to do a thorough review of your entire profile. And part of that is looking at any endorsements you've received for specific skills that are key to the types of positions that they know are important for the jobs that they're recruiting for, but also any recommendations based off of current and previous colleagues or anybody else that can attest to the skills and qualifications that you have, or just your ability to be an effective collaborator or leader in any type of opportunity that that person has had the pleasure to have a shared experience with you. So thinking about who you would want to connect with to serve as a recommendation or ask for a recommendation via LinkedIn is a great strategy for just reinforcing information, even if you're not currently looking for employment. It's good to build those up over time. It's also important to think about how you're not only requesting these recommendations via LinkedIn, but you're also giving those recommendations. When you're asking somebody for a recommendation via in such a public way, because this information is going to be published, and you can also request that they make revisions to it before it's published to your LinkedIn profile, that you're giving them a recommendation as well. On your public profile, LinkedIn does communicate how many recommendations you've received, and it'll also include those recommendations, what those contacts have said about you, but also the recommendations that you have given. So keeping that in mind is going to be very important, because they can also see that information that you've written about other contacts that you've had current and previous work relationships with. So it's a good practice to get into, especially if you're not looking for if you're currently not looking for employment, but you're wanting to prepare that section of your LinkedIn profile and actually get some more professional connections. It's always good to make sure that you're giving those recommendations as well, and not just soliciting them from those who are going to speak about current and past work relationships that you've had. Very good question. And yeah, I can go on and on and on about LinkedIn recommendations and endorsements and thinking about that. But I also think that when you're moving through a hiring process and selecting these references that are going to be included as part of your application, you really want to think strategically about how those connections are going to clearly articulate that you're the best person for the position. And some typical questions that recommendations or references receive are: tell me about the nature of your professional relationship with said candidate. Were you their boss? That wasn't clear, for instance. Maybe they're asking about specific activities that were mentioned in your resume that they want to have a little bit more elaboration on from your perspective. Maybe they're asking if you're a current supervisor or previous supervisor, would you hire this person again? That's a good indicator of, your ability to maybe left on good terms if you're currently not with that employer anymore, or if you're somebody that is still viewed as a very important asset to that team. Just a simple yes or no can be very important in how they are going to think about your candidacy moving forward. So those are some typical questions that references are asked. And they're usually standardized across any references that will be asked in a specific hiring process. All references will typically be asked the same list of questions, and their responses will typically be documented by the hiring official. Great questions. What other questions do you have about references? Yeah, I always think it's important that we have a good understanding of our individual strengths and our value proposition when we're putting together these applications. But a key component to that is how we can reinforce the information. And reinforcing that information comes in many different formats. One, through artifacts. If you have work samples that can be showcased in an online portfolio or as media attachments to LinkedIn, that gives the hiring official a good idea of what the quality of your work looks like and the degree of how effective you potentially are in producing something of that caliber. Even if you're giving a little bit of a description that lets them know of the parameters of what that specific work project was or what that assignment was, would be a good indicator of, you know, how you were able to take this prompt or this specific responsibility and what you produced. It really shares that story for them. It also is a great way then for any person who is going to speak on your behalf about your experience, how they are familiar with the quality of your work and the overall value that you have in that specific role. That's extremely important when you're looking at how you are going to select those who are going to potentially serve as references when moving through a hiring process. So I just got a question about knowing how will you know if references have been contacted or not? So that's a wonderful question. And it's a, you may know and you may not know. One way that I would typically infer that a reference may be contacted is if I make it through the, you know, if there's only 2 rounds of interviews and I've made it through the second round, I can likely, you know, gauge from that hiring manager by asking them, you know, what are the next steps in the hiring process? And they may indicate that they need to complete some administrative work that may include a background check and also checking your professional references. Then you can alert those references that they may be contacted about a specific position that you have applied for. Then you can share with them the job description and the application materials that you have used to apply for that specific job. And that will help them ultimately prepare for a conversation that they're going to have. It may also be a very standardized email that they receive where they have to check off some boxes or respond to some questions in writing, and that's it. They may not even receive a phone call from that person. It's good to check though with your references that they have a voicemail set up, that their voicemail isn't full, just because you don't want a potential hiring manager to keep missing the opportunity to get information from a reference, especially if they don't have a voicemail set up so that they don't know to contact somebody back. That's just a good practice to get into so that you don't have a hiring manager communicate back to you that none of your references have been able to get contacted or have returned any of their calls. You definitely want to make sure that your references are alerted to you know, where you're at in the hiring process, what your goal is, and that you've shared all that information with them. Good question. Any other questions about references? I think it's just always important that you communicate the outcome so that you're closing that loop. No reference may still be anticipating a phone call if they know that you've accepted a position. Communicating things by email, phone call, or sending them a nice handwritten note is a good gesture. It's a good professional gesture, especially if you're potentially going to be asking them to serve as a reference again in the future. They'll remember how you handled their participation in that hiring process previously. So it's a good practice to get into so that they're kept in the loop from the start through completion. And obviously they'll be alerted if you're connected on LinkedIn, if you've indicated on LinkedIn that you've started a new role and that's published to your profile. They may learn that way too, but it's always good for them to know before the world knows, so that they know that they aren't going to be anticipating any future, at least in the near future, phone calls or emails from a potential hiring manager. Okay, are there any good guidelines when you're asked to write a letter recommendation for someone who has asked you to be a reference? Yeah, so it depends. So typically letters of recommendation are very specific to different types of hiring or application processes. So for instance, a letter of recommendation may be more common in an application for um, like a school or college, or for a specific credential, or as a reference for a recognition that you are being considered for. As far as frameworks for how you would prepare a reference for that sort of recommendation would be dependent on the prompt that the application outlines to anybody who is potentially going to serve or agree to serve as a recommendation. Sometimes those types of recommendations could be headaches for ourselves because we don't necessarily have control over when they submit them. And let's say, for instance, if you have an application that requires a written recommendation, and they're given a very specific prompt, like, tell me about your professional experience with this candidate. And you give them the directions and they need to submit everything by April, the end of April. Well, you may receive an email noting that your application is complete because somebody submitted a reference on your behalf, but sometimes some applicant tracking systems aren't as sophisticated and they may not be able to set up some of those notifications to let the candidate know that somebody's submitted a part of their application. So my recommendation is that you stay on top of those deadlines, or you're giving them a deadline, and making sure that they're clear about the expectations that are included within the actual application, so that they're not confused about how they need to articulate the information that you're hoping that they communicate in that specific process. The other thing is just knowing exactly what information you want to connect to them, like your resume, or CV if it's more academic and you're in an academic track career. That would be important information to share. If it's for an honor or recognition and there needs to be recommendations for this recognition as part of the application, you may want to give them a complete background of what that recognition is so that they can speak specifically about how you are a good fit for that recognition, especially if a panel of people are going to be reviewing many applications for a specific honor or award. So giving them that information would be very helpful. And sometimes those references will share those recommendations with you on beforehand. They're not obligated to do so, but sometimes they do because they're rooting for you and they want you to be successful. Sometimes recommendations are very candid and they'll tell you that they may not know enough about that aspect of who you are professionally, or have not had a lot of experience with you, to be able to really speak in depth about a specific hiring process that you're moving through, or will be moving through, or a recognition or award. They may not really know enough about you to really give a whole lot of information that would help further your candidacy for that specific type of honor or award. So kind of thinking about who you want to serve and being very clear is going to be important there. It's a wonderful question. And, you know, there's references and recommendations for a variety of different professional accolades. And one of those, you know, is giving our potential references, you know, a complete picture of who we are and our goals and what we've accomplished. So always kind of having those updated application materials is great, because you never know when someone is going to request that information, and you don't necessarily want something so outdated that, you know, you're going to miss some key pieces of information because you put them together so quickly, and may have missed an opportunity to emphasize something extremely valuable that would be helpful to know. So really having those ready to go and share with people who may serve as references in the future is a good practice to get into. Even if your documents are extremely outdated, it's never too late to you know, put that on your to-do list, and begin thinking about how you want that to be organized in an easy to read format, and then how your references will be a part of that process. That's a good consideration for that moving forward. Perfect. Any additional questions? These questions have been very helpful, and I've actually been jotting these down to further some of the guides and resources that we use for the Webster University alumni community and current students, because all of these questions are valuable considerations that you have personally, but also are helpful for anybody out there who is going to be just reviewing some of the resources or information about the overall importance of, you know, the reference as part of the hiring process. So these questions definitely do help. I appreciate that. And again, today's Spark presentation is included in the chat box. I'll include it again, just in case. I noticed a few people joined our session a couple minutes behind the start time. And I also have information about resume writing and LinkedIn profile optimization services, and my email address is in there if that's something that you're interested in working on together. I'm always happy to help further one's professional goals by clearly helping them articulate their skills, strengths, and overall value proposition in those high stakes documents. So definitely help a lot of different level professionals, from entry level to mid-level career through the latter end of one's career, if they're looking to explore something completely different that they've never done before. I'm always happy to learn about personal career goals and how I can help people achieve those through personal branding. But again, references are the seller here. And I think that it's just overall important that we know and can articulate our skills and qualifications in a way that's going to convey expertise, interest, and overall fitness for what that next position is going to be. So if we can clearly articulate that, then our references are going to know how effective we have been in a specific role by focusing on key accomplishments, ways that we have been able to grow something or expand reach, make something more inclusive or equitable. Those are all kinds of great ways that we can communicate how valuable we are in our different roles, whether they're, at the beginning of our career or latter end. We all have this trajectory of growth and experience that could be valuable for our recommendations to know, so they can reference that information when they're contacted at the latter end of that hiring process. All right, there's one more LinkedIn themed broadcast that's coming up in a couple weeks. I encourage you to check your email if you've already registered for our LinkedIn profile summary optimization broadcast. I look forward to your participation there. I just think that in the age of the digital resume, recommendations and references are very fluid because we can see them grow over time, and as we're introduced to new contacts who have a firsthand view of our experience, it's another opportunity for them to prepare messaging that could be incorporated into our public profiles. So our final broadcast for the Webster.careers series of this year will be in a couple weeks. So be on the lookout for an additional email. And also we'll be looking at a potential series that we'll have over the summer, and it'll be more of a coffee talk style series where you can just ask questions in a few different topical areas. So we'll be announcing that in the coming weeks as well, just to keep conversations moving forward, keep you on track. If you have some very specific goals, we want to help support you in what those goals may be by keeping you up to date and in sync with trends that are happening right out there in the world of work. And also we learn from you. We know that there are many different academic and career interests of our alumni and community members, those who are participating in our semi-monthly broadcasts. So these help us shape conversations moving forward. So we definitely appreciate when you ask us questions, because we're vigilant and we're taking note of what some of the common themes are so that we can prepare some future broadcasts with this information front and center. Well, again, thank you again for your participation in our Tuesday broadcast, and I look forward to your next participation at our final one. So thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.